What would you do if you discovered your perfect life was built on lies? Sarah Matthews thought she had it all. A mansion in the Hamptons, a successful husband worth $180 million, and the security that comes with marrying into Manhattan's elite. But when her 8-year-old son innocently asked, "Mommy, why does Daddy have two girlfriends?" her world shattered like crystal on marble. This isn't just another story about infidelity. This is the shocking true account of how a real estate mogul systematically destroyed his wife's identity, forged financial documents to frame her for embezzlement, and used their own child as a weapon in his twisted game of psychological warfare. But what David Sterling didn't expect was that the woman he tried to erase would find an unlikely ally. A tech billionaire with the resources to fight back and the moral compass to seek justice. What follows is a masterclass in strategic revenge, where the hunted becomes the hunter, and where a silent exit becomes the loudest victory of all. Stay with me, because this story will change how you think about power, manipulation, and the incredible strength that lies dormant within us all. Sarah Matthews was arranging white peonies in her favorite crystal vase when her 8-year-old son Thomas dropped the bomb that would shatter her carefully constructed world. "Mommy, why does Daddy have two girlfriends?" he asked, swinging his legs from the marble kitchen counter of their Hamptons estate. Sarah's hands stilled on the delicate petals. The October morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows suddenly felt too bright, too harsh. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well, you're his girlfriend because you're married," Thomas explained with the logical simplicity that only children possess. "But there's also Victoria who comes to his office. She has really long blonde hair, and she always hugs him. She told me to call her Auntie Vicky." The crystal vase slipped from Sarah's fingers, shattering against the Italian marble with a sound that seemed to echo through the cavernous kitchen. Water and flower stems scattered across the floor like the fragments of her marriage. "Tommy," she whispered, kneeling to gather the broken pieces, her voice barely steady. "When did you meet Victoria?" "Last week when I visited Daddy's office. She was there again yesterday, too. She's really pretty, Mommy. She showed me pictures on her phone of her at the beach. She has lots of followers." Sarah cut her finger on a shard of crystal, watching a drop of blood fall onto the white marble. The pain was sharp and immediate, unlike the slow, creeping realization that had been building for months. David's late nights, his sudden interest in the gym, his new cologne, the way he'd started keeping his phone face down. She had been married to David Sterling for 10 years. He was a real estate mogul worth $180 million, a man who owned half of Manhattan's luxury high-rises. She had met him when she was a 25-year-old investment banker, sharp and ambitious. Now at 35, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. "Don't tell Daddy we talked about this, okay?" Sarah said, forcing a smile as she bandaged her finger. "It's our secret." Thomas nodded solemnly, already distracted by his iPad. But Sarah's mind was racing. Victoria, a blonde with lots of followers. It had to be Victoria Hayes, the lifestyle influencer she'd seen commenting on David's business posts on Instagram. 28 years old with 2 million followers and a smile that could sell anything. That evening, David came home at 11:30, claiming he'd been in meetings. Sarah watched him from the top of the marble staircase as he set his keys on the entry table. His hair was slightly mussed, his tie loosened. There was a lightness in his step she hadn't seen in years. "How was your day?" she asked, descending the stairs in her silk nightgown. David looked up, and for just a moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Guilt? Annoyance? Long meetings with investors. You know how it is. But she didn't know how it was anymore. She hadn't worked since Thomas was born. David had convinced her that their son needed her at home, that his income was more than enough. Gradually, she'd lost touch with her former colleagues, her confidence, her sense of self. "David," she said, her heart hammering, "we need to talk." He was already heading toward his study. "Can it wait? I have calls to make." "It's 11:30 at night." "Hong Kong is just waking up, Sarah. Some of us have to work." The dismissal was casual, practiced. How many times had he brushed her off this way? How many times had she accepted it? "I know about Victoria," she said quietly. David froze with his hand on the study door. When he turned around, his face had transformed. Gone was any pretense of affection or even basic kindness. His eyes were cold, calculating. What exactly do you think you know? The way he said it, the complete lack of denial or surprise, told her everything. This wasn't a recent development. This was established, comfortable, ongoing. Thomas told me about her, about visiting your office, about calling her Auntie Vicky. David's laugh was sharp and cruel. You're going to listen to an 8-year-old's imagination? That's pathetic even for you, Sarah. But she could see it in his eyes. The truth, the contempt, the complete lack of remorse. How long, she whispered. Does it matter? It matters to me. David stepped closer, and she could smell unfamiliar perfume on his shirt. 2 years, he said, his voice soft but merciless. And before you get any ideas about playing the wrong wife, let me remind you of a few things. This house, your credit cards, your comfortable little life, all of it exists because I allow it. You have no income, no assets in your name, and no leverage. You're completely dependent on me. Sarah felt the walls of the foyer closing in. The marble beneath her bare feet felt like ice. Thomas needs stability, David continued. He needs his father, and any judge in New York will see that I can provide for him in ways you never could. So I suggest you think very carefully about what you want to do with this information. With that, he disappeared into his study, leaving Sarah alone in the vast, silent house that had never felt less like home. She stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of her powerlessness settle around her like a shroud. She was trapped in a marriage to a man who despised her, and she had no idea how to escape. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of David making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly. When she came downstairs, he looked up with a warm smile that made her question her own sanity. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, pulling her into his arms and kissing her forehead. "I'm sorry about last night. I was exhausted and said things I didn't mean." Sarah stood stiffly in his embrace. "David, about Victoria." "Sarah," he interrupted gently, "there is no Victoria, not in the way you're thinking. Yes, I work with influencers on marketing campaigns. Yes, some of them are young and attractive, but that's business. You know how important image is in real estate." His voice was so reasonable, so patient, that Sarah felt her certainty wavering. This was the David she'd fallen in love with. Confident, successful, but tender with her. But Thomas is 8 years old. He probably misunderstood a business meeting. You know how kids are. David cupped her face in his hands. "Sarah, I love you. I love our family. Why would I risk everything we've built for some Instagram girl?" For a moment, Sarah wanted to believe him. It would be so much easier to believe him. To go back to her comfortable denial, her carefully scheduled life of charity luncheons and tennis lessons. "Maybe we should go to counseling," she said tentatively. David's hands tightened slightly on her face, his thumbs pressing against her cheekbones. "Of course, if that would make you feel better. Though I have to say, I'm a little concerned about your state of mind lately. You've seemed paranoid, anxious. Maybe you should see someone alone first." There it was, the subtle shift. Suddenly she was the problem. She was paranoid. She was anxious. She was the one who needed help. "I'm not crazy, David. I never said you were. I'm worried about you. The isolation, staying home all day, it's not healthy. Maybe you need to get back to work, have something of your own." But they both knew that was impossible. Her finance skills were a decade out of date. Her professional network had withered. David had made sure of that, encouraging her to decline invitations, to skip networking events, to focus on being a perfect wife and mother. Over the following weeks, David was the model husband. He brought her flowers, took her to dinner at Le Bernardin, made love to her with an attention he hadn't shown in years. Sarah began to wonder if she had imagined everything, but she couldn't forget Thomas's innocent words. And late at night, when David thought she was sleeping, she heard him making whispered phone calls in his study. The conversations were brief, cryptic, but the tone was intimate in a way that made her stomach clench. The doubt gnawed at her like a persistent ache. She found herself studying David's face when he thought she wasn't looking, searching for signs of deception. She noticed how he positioned his phone screen away from her, how he'd started taking showers immediately after coming home from work, how he'd developed new preferences in cologne and clothing. Sarah had always been intuitive about people. It was what had made her successful in investment banking before David convinced her to give up her career. Now that same intuition was screaming that something was wrong, but David's relentless gaslighting made her doubt her own perceptions. "You're imagining things," he would say when she questioned his late nights. "You're being paranoid," when she asked about his phone calls. "You're not thinking clearly," when she pressed for explanations. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective. David had years of practice in manipulation, in making her feel small and insignificant. He knew exactly which buttons to push to make her question herself. 2 weeks into his campaign of loving attention, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. She was in David's study looking for a pen when she accidentally knocked over a stack of legal documents. Hidden beneath them was a small black phone she'd never seen before. Her hands shaking, she powered it on. The message history made her stomach lurch. "Victoria, can't wait to see you tonight, wearing that red dress you bought me." David, "My wife is getting suspicious. We need to be more careful." Victoria, "Maybe it's time to tell her. I'm tired of hiding." David, "Not yet. I need to secure a few more assets first. Trust me, baby. By Christmas, we'll be together." The messages went back months, photos, videos, intimate conversations about their future together. Plans for a life that didn't include Sarah or Thomas. Sarah screenshotted everything, her fingers trembling as she forwarded the evidence to her own email. Then she carefully replaced the burner phone exactly where she'd found it. That night, David came home with champagne and tickets to see Hamilton on Broadway. "I thought we could have a date night," he said, kissing her neck. "Just like old times." Sarah looked at his handsome face, his practiced smile, and felt a cold clarity settle over her. He wasn't just cheating. He was planning, calculating, moving pieces on a chessboard where she was nothing more than a pawn to be discarded when convenient. "That sounds wonderful," she said, matching his smile with one of her own. But inside, Sarah was already planning her own game. She might be trapped, but she wasn't helpless, and she was done being David Sterling's victim. The war for her life was about to begin. Sarah knew she needed help, but she also knew she had to be careful. David had connections throughout New York's legal and financial community. One wrong move and she could find herself completely isolated, her credibility destroyed before she even began to fight back. Jenny Collins had been her roommate at Columbia and maid of honor at her wedding. More importantly, Jenny had become one of Manhattan's most feared divorce attorneys. If anyone could help Sarah navigate this treacherous territory, it was Jenny. They met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from the Upper East Side circles where Sarah might be recognized. The October afternoon was crisp, and Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she waited for Jenny to arrive. "You look terrible," Jenny said by way of greeting, sliding into the booth across from Sarah. But then again, dealing with David Sterling would make anyone look like hell. Sarah managed a weak smile. "You always were direct." "It served me well in divorce court." Jenny's expression grew serious as Sarah showed her the screenshots from the burner phone. "I always knew David was a snake, but this is worse than I thought. He's been planning this for a while." Jenny studied the messages with the clinical precision that had made her reputation. "Look at this," she pointed to one exchange. "He's talking about moving assets offshore. Sarah, he's not just planning to leave you. He's planning to hide his money so you can't touch it in the divorce." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Can he do that?" "Not legally, but David has expensive lawyers and offshore connections. If he gets ahead of this, he could make your life very difficult." Jenny leaned forward. "We need to move fast. File first, freeze assets, establish your case before he knows what hit him." Over the next 2 weeks, Jenny worked quietly to build Sarah's case. They documented David's assets, gathered evidence of his affair, and prepared for war. Sarah played the perfect wife, attending David's business dinners and charity galas, smiling and nodding while her husband's hand rested possessively on her back. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 10 years learning to be invisible in her own marriage. Now that invisibility was her greatest weapon. But David was smarter than they'd anticipated. Sarah came home from lunch with Jenny to find David waiting in the living room with two men in expensive suits, his lawyer and someone she didn't recognize. "Sarah," David said, his voice calm but his eyes like ice. "We need to talk." She knew immediately that something had gone wrong. David's posture was too confident, too relaxed for a man who was about to be blindsided by divorce papers. "I've just learned something very interesting," David continued. "It seems you've been having lunch with Jenny Collins." "Jenny Collins, who specializes in high-asset divorces?" "That's curious, don't you think?" Sarah's mouth went dry. Someone had been watching her. Someone had reported back to David. "I can explain." "I'm sure you can. But first, let me explain something to you." David nodded to one of the men, who opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've had my own investigators looking into our finances. Did you know that there are irregularities in the household accounts? Missing money, transfers to accounts I didn't authorize." Sarah stared at him in confusion. "What are you talking about?" $50,000 transferred to an offshore account, using forged signatures. David's smile was predatory. "Now, I know you didn't actually steal this money, Sarah, but I have documentation that suggests you did. Documentation that would be very difficult to disprove in court." The man from the briefcase handed her a stack of papers. Bank statements, transfer orders, signatures that looked like hers but weren't quite right. "You forged these," Sarah whispered. "Can you prove that? Can you prove that a woman facing divorce wouldn't try to hide assets? Especially a woman with no income of her own, looking at a very uncertain future?" Sarah felt the walls closing in. This was why David had been so attentive recently. Not because he felt guilty, but because he was buying time to set his trap. "Here's what's going to happen," David said, standing up. "You're going to stop talking to divorce attorneys. You're going to be a good wife and mother. And when the time comes, you're going to agree to a very reasonable settlement that allows Thomas to stay with his father, where he belongs. And if I don't," David's smile turned arctic, "then you'll find yourself facing criminal charges for embezzlement. You'll lose Thomas completely, and you'll discover just how alone you really are in this world." After the men left, Sarah sat in her living room, staring at the forged documents. David had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. He'd known about Jenny, probably known about everything. She was trapped in a marriage to a man who was systematically destroying her life, and she had no idea how to fight back. Sarah picked up her phone to call Jenny, only to discover that her cell service had been cut off. When she tried the landline, there was no dial tone. David had isolated her completely. That evening, he came home whistling, as if nothing had happened. "I've made dinner reservations at Le Bernardin," he announced. "I thought we should celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "Our renewed commitment to each other, to our family." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "We're going to be very happy together, Sarah. You'll see." The restaurant was David's favorite, a place where he was known and fawned over. The maitre d' seated them at the best table, the one with a view of the entire dining room. David ordered champagne in the tasting menu, playing the role of devoted husband with practiced ease. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. His grip was firm, possessive. "I'm sorry we've been having problems. Marriage is work, isn't it? But I think we're stronger now." Sarah nodded, playing her part. Around them, other diners smiled at the attractive couple celebrating their love. If only they knew the truth. Halfway through dinner, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his smile widened. "Excuse me for just a moment," he said, standing up. "Business call." Sarah watched him step onto the restaurant's terrace, his phone pressed to his ear. Through the glass, she could see him laughing, gesturing animatedly. When he returned, he was practically glowing. "Good news?" she asked. "The best. That new development in Soho just got final approval. We're about to make a fortune." He raised his champagne glass. "To success." But as Sarah lifted her glass, she noticed David's expression change. His smile faded as he looked at something behind her. "Well, well," he said softly. "Look who's here." Sarah turned to see Victoria Hayes being seated at a table across the restaurant. She was stunning in a way that made Sarah feel ancient, wearing a red dress that hugged every curve. Her blonde hair caught the light like spun gold, and every man in the restaurant was stealing glances at her. "What a coincidence," David murmured, but there was tension in his voice now. "Should we go say hello?" Before Sarah could respond, Victoria looked up and saw them. Her face lit up with what appeared to be genuine surprise and delight. She waved, a gesture so natural and friendly that Sarah almost waved back. "David! Sarah!" Victoria called out, approaching their table with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "What a lovely surprise!" Up close, Victoria was even more beautiful. Her skin was flawless, her makeup perfectly applied, her smile warm and engaging. She looked like everything Sarah used to be before marriage and motherhood wore her down. "Victoria," David said, standing to give her a kiss on both cheeks. "You look absolutely stunning." "Sarah, you remember Victoria Hayes, don't you? She's been helping with the marketing campaign for our new properties." "Of course," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Lovely to see you again." "I follow your Instagram," Victoria said, her voice bright and enthusiastic. "Your charity work is so inspiring. David is lucky to have such a dedicated wife." The words were perfectly innocent, but there was something in Victoria's eyes, a spark of amusement that made Sarah's skin crawl. This woman knew exactly what she was doing. "Are you dining alone?" David asked, and Sarah caught the subtle tension in his voice. "Oh no, I'm waiting for my date," Victoria said, glancing back at her table. "He's parking the car. You'd probably know him, actually. Marcus Blackwood?" Sarah felt David stiffen beside her. Marcus Blackwood was a name everyone in New York knew. Tech billionaire, worth nearly $3 billion, known for his privacy and his ruthless business practices. "Marcus Blackwood," David repeated, and Sarah could hear the forced casualness in his voice. "How did you meet?" "Through mutual friends. He's absolutely brilliant, and so different from the usual tech guys, you know? He actually reads books." Victoria laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Anyway, I should get back. Lovely seeing you both." She glided back to her table just as a tall, dark-haired man in an impeccably tailored suit walked in. Marcus Blackwood moved with the quiet confidence of someone who owned the world, but didn't need to advertise it. He kissed Victoria's hand before sitting down, never once glancing in David and Sarah's direction. "Interesting," David said, his voice tight. "I didn't know they were seeing each other." Sarah studied her husband's face. For the first time in months, David looked unsure of himself. The appearance of Marcus Blackwood had clearly rattled him. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Marcus Blackwood doesn't date casually," David said, his eyes fixed on the couple across the room. "If he's here with Victoria, it means something." Sarah filed this information away. David was worried about something, and David Sterling didn't worry without good reason. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. David kept glancing at Victoria's table, his jaw tight with tension. When they finally left, Sarah caught sight of Victoria laughing at something Marcus had said, her hand resting on his arm with easy intimacy. In the car, David was unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. "Fine," he said shortly, "just thinking about business." But Sarah could see the wheels turning in her husband's head. Whatever game he'd been playing, the rules had just changed. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Over the following days, Sarah watched David with new eyes. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable, was developing cracks. He made increasingly frequent calls behind closed doors, snapped at Thomas over breakfast, and canceled a business trip to Miami, something he never did unless the situation was critical. Sarah had always been good at reading people. It was what had made her successful in investment banking before David convinced her to give up her career. Now, watching her husband's growing anxiety, she began to see weaknesses in his perfect plan. The breakthrough came when Sarah was cleaning Thomas's room and found his iPad open to a message thread. Her son had been texting with his friend Jake about a sleepover, but Sarah's attention was caught by an earlier conversation. "Thomas, my dad is really mad about something." "Jake, oh, why?" "Thomas, I heard him yelling on the phone about Marcus. He said a bad word." Sarah's pulse quickened. Marcus. Marcus Blackwood, the man Victoria had been dining with. That evening, Sarah made her move. "David," she said over dinner, "I've been thinking about what you said, about being a better wife." David looked up from his phone, where he'd been typing furiously. "Oh? I want to try harder. For Thomas. For us." Sarah kept her voice soft, submissive. "Maybe I could help with your business? I used to be good with numbers." For a moment, David's face softened. This was the Sarah he remembered. the compliant woman who deferred to his judgment. That's sweet, but you wouldn't understand the complexities. I could learn. I could start small, maybe just reviewing some of the marketing materials. Sarah paused, then added casually, I thought Victoria's work was very impressive. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Victoria's fine, though her situation has become more complicated recently. Oh? David set down his phone, studying Sarah's face. She's gotten involved with someone who could complicate things. Marcus Blackwood. Sarah widened her eyes in what she hoped looked like innocent curiosity. The tech billionaire? That's exciting for her. It's problematic, David said sharply. Marcus has a reputation for being very protective of the people in his life. He doesn't like competition. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. David wasn't just worried about losing Victoria to another man. He was worried about Marcus Blackwood discovering their affair. I'm sure it won't affect your business relationship, Sarah said carefully. No, David agreed, but his voice was strained. Of course not. That night, after David fell asleep, Sarah crept down to his study. She needed to understand what had her husband so rattled. The burner phone was still hidden behind the legal documents, but when she powered it on, she found that the message thread with Victoria had been deleted. Instead, there was a new contact. MB Investigation Services. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the exchange. David, I need you to find out everything about Marcus Blackwood's relationship with Victoria Hayes. How serious it is, how much he knows about her past relationships. MB Investigation. This is dangerous territory, Mr. Sterling. Blackwood has resources that most people can't imagine. Are you sure you want to poke this bear? David, just do the job I'm paying you for. MB Investigation. Your funeral. Report will be ready tomorrow. Sarah quickly screenshotted the conversation and forwarded it to her own email before deleting the evidence from her sent folder. Then she carefully replaced the phone and crept back to bed. Lying next to her sleeping husband, Sarah's mind raced. David was investigating Marcus Blackwood, which meant he saw the billionaire as a threat. But why? What could Marcus possibly know that would worry David so much? The answer came to her as she remembered Victoria's words at the restaurant. He's so different from the usual tech guys. He actually reads books. Marcus Blackwood wasn't just Victoria's new boyfriend. He was smart, wealthy, and powerful enough to pose a real threat to David's carefully constructed plans. If Marcus discovered David's affair with Victoria, if he learned about David's manipulation and financial maneuvering, for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. She might not be able to fight David alone, but she was beginning to suspect she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The next morning brought confirmation that David's world was shifting beneath his feet. Sarah was having coffee on the terrace when Thomas came running from the house, excited about something he'd seen on his iPad. Mommy, look, it's Uncle Marcus. Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Uncle Marcus? Thomas showed her the screen, which displayed a news article about Marcus Blackwood's latest acquisition. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the headline. It was Thomas's easy familiarity with the name. You know Marcus Blackwood? He's not really my uncle, Thomas said with 8-year-old logic. But he told me to call him that. He's really nice. He taught me about computers. Sarah's heart stopped. When did you meet him, honey? At Dad's office. He was there talking to Dad about business stuff. He saw me playing games and showed me how to code. He said I was really smart. The timeline was becoming clearer. Marcus hadn't just met Victoria recently. He'd been in David's orbit for weeks, maybe months, and David had never mentioned it. Thomas, Sarah said carefully. When was this? Maybe a month ago. Dad was really happy that day. He kept saying Uncle Marcus was going to make us all rich. Sarah's blood ran cold. A month ago was right around the time David had started his campaign to isolate her, right before he'd revealed the forged financial documents. Whatever deal David had been pursuing with Marcus, it had fallen apart. And now Marcus was dating Victoria. That afternoon, while David was at the office, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. She found Marcus Blackwood's office address and took a taxi into Manhattan. The decision felt reckless and terrifying, but Sarah was running out of options. David had systematically cut off every avenue of escape, every potential ally. But maybe, just maybe, Marcus Blackwood represented a chance she couldn't afford to ignore. As the taxi pulled up to the sleek glass tower that housed Blackwood Industries, Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to bet everything on a stranger who might be her only hope for freedom. Blackwood Industries occupied the top 15 floors of a sleek glass tower in Midtown. The lobby was minimalist and intimidating, filled with the kind of quiet that only serious money could buy. Sarah approached the reception desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'd like to see Marcus Blackwood," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The receptionist, a young man with the kind of perfect grooming that suggested he was paid very well to be discreetly judgmental, looked her up and down with practiced assessment. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm Sarah Sterling. I believe he knows my husband, David Sterling." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. "One moment, please. Morn." He made a quiet phone call, speaking in tones too low for Sarah to hear. After a few minutes, he hung up and smiled politely. "Mr. Blackwood will see you. 42nd floor." The elevator ride felt endless. Sarah stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. She was about to walk into the office of one of the most powerful men in America and essentially confess that her marriage was a fraud. The 42nd floor was all glass and steel, with panoramic views of Central Park that took Sarah's breath away. Marcus Blackwood's assistant, a woman who looked like she could run a small country in her spare time, led Sarah through a series of corridors to a corner office that was somehow both imposing and welcoming. Marcus Blackwood rose from behind his desk as she entered. He was taller than she'd expected, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His suit was perfectly tailored, but he wore it with the ease of someone who was comfortable in his own skin. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, extending his hand, "this is unexpected." "Thank you for seeing me," Sarah said, accepting the handshake. His grip was firm but not crushing, confident but not aggressive. "Please sit." He gestured to a pair of leather chairs arranged around a coffee table. "Can I offer you anything? Water? Coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." Sarah sat down, acutely aware that her simple dress and nervous energy were completely out of place in this temple of power and success. Marcus took the chair across from her, his posture relaxed but alert. "I have to admit, I'm curious about this visit. Your husband and I have some business history, but it's been a while since we've spoken." Sarah took a deep breath. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Are you dating Victoria Hayes?" If the question surprised him, Marcus didn't show it. His expression remained neutral, professional. "That's rather personal. May I ask why you want to know?" "Because my husband is having an affair with her, and I think you already know that." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below. "Yes," he said finally. "I know about David's relationship with Victoria." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes never leaving her face. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I think we need to have a very frank conversation. But first I need to know, what do you want from this meeting?" Sarah looked out at the Manhattan skyline, at the city that had once felt like home, but now felt like a beautiful prison. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I want my life back. I want my son to be safe. And I want David to pay for what he's done." Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since entering his office, Sarah saw something in his eyes that looked like approval. "Then I think we can help each other." Marcus poured himself a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the coffee table, his movements deliberate and calm. Sarah had the distinct impression that very little surprised this man. "Your husband approached me 6 months ago with a proposal," Marcus began, "a real estate development project that would have required significant investment from my company. The numbers looked good initially." Sarah nodded, remembering David's excitement about a mysterious new deal that was going to change everything. During our due diligence process, my team discovered some irregularities in David's financial statements. Nothing criminal, necessarily, but enough to make us cautious. We decided to pass on the investment. That must have upset him considerably. David Sterling is a man accustomed to getting what he wants. Marcus's expression darkened. What concerned me more was his reaction to our withdrawal. He became obsessed with changing our minds, with finding leverage to force our participation. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of leverage? He had his people investigate my personal life, my business relationships, my family. It was extensive and invasive. Marcus set down his glass, his jaw tightening slightly. That's when Victoria contacted me. Victoria contacted you? She came to me 3 weeks ago. Apparently, David had been pressuring her to gather information about me. Personal information. Details about my relationships, my habits, anything that could be used against me. Sarah stared at him in confusion. The timeline didn't make sense. But I thought you two were dating. Marcus's smile was rueful. We are now, but our first meeting was purely transactional. Victoria was scared, Sarah. David had been making threats about what would happen to her career if she didn't cooperate. She was looking for protection. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that made Sarah feel sick. David hadn't just been cheating. He'd been using Victoria as a weapon against Marcus, trying to manipulate both of them for his own gain. She's working with you against David? Victoria made her choice when she realized what kind of man she'd gotten involved with. She's been documenting her conversations with David, recording his threats and demands. She has evidence that would destroy him. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Why would she help me? I'm the wife he's cheating on. Because Victoria isn't a monster, despite what you might think. She was manipulated too. David told her you were separated, that the divorce was amicable, that you were fine with their relationship. She didn't learn the truth until recently. Marcus stood and walked to his desk, returning with a manila folder thick with documents. Victoria wanted you to see this. Inside the folder were printed emails between David and Victoria, dating back nearly a year. As Sarah read them, her anger grew with each page. David had painted himself as a victim of a cold, distant marriage. He'd claimed Sarah was mentally unstable, possibly dangerous. He'd suggested that Thomas would be better off without her. Most damning of all were David's own words about his plans for their marriage. Sarah has been useful, but she's becoming a liability. Once I secure a few more assets and establish custody arrangements, I'll be free to start over. The prenup will limit her settlement, and the evidence I've gathered about her mental state will ensure I keep Thomas. Sarah's hands were shaking by the time she finished reading. David hadn't just been planning to leave her. He'd been systematically destroying her reputation and credibility to ensure she'd have nothing when he was done with her. There's more, Marcus said gently. Victoria recorded some of their recent conversations. Would you like to hear them? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Marcus pulled out his phone and played a recording. David's voice filled the office, clear and unmistakable. The beauty of it is that Sarah has no idea what's coming. She's so isolated now, so dependent on me, that she'll accept whatever terms I offer. And if she doesn't, I have enough evidence of her instability to destroy her in court. Thomas will stay with me, where he belongs. Hey, Victoria's voice responded, sounding uncertain. David, this seems cruel. Maybe we should just be honest with her. David laughed, a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. Honest? Victoria, Sarah's a weak woman who's never had to fight for anything in her life. She doesn't deserve honesty. She deserves exactly what she's going to get. Nothing. Marcus turned off the recording. Sarah was crying, tears of rage and heartbreak streaming down her face. The man she'd loved and trusted for 10 years had been planning her destruction with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. I'm sorry, Marcus said softly. I know this is painful. He's been planning this for a year, Sarah whispered. Everything. The isolation, the financial manipulation, even Thomas calling Victoria auntie. It was all part of his plan. Yes, but Sarah, you need to understand something important. David made a crucial mistake. Sarah looked up at him through her tears, desperate for any ray of hope in the darkness that had become her life. He underestimated you, and he completely misunderstood the kind of man I am. Marcus's voice was quiet but steel-hard. I don't like bullies. I especially don't like men who hurt women and children. And I have resources that David Sterling can't even imagine. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she'd forgotten existed. The possibility of fighting back and winning. What do we do? She asked. Marcus smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. We destroy him. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah lived a double life more complex than any spy thriller. By day, she played the part of the submissive wife, attending charity luncheons and school events with Thomas, smiling and nodding at conversations about vacation homes and private school applications. By night, she worked with Marcus and Victoria to build a case that would end David's reign of manipulation forever. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would let David make the first move, filing for divorce on his own terms, confident in his ability to control the narrative. Then they would systematically dismantle every lie he'd built their marriage on, using his own words and actions against him. Victoria had provided the most damaging evidence. Not just the recordings, but financial documents David had shared with her, showing how he'd been hiding assets in offshore accounts for months. He'd been so confident in his control over both women that he'd never imagined they might compare notes. He gave me access to his private email account, Victoria explained during one of their clandestine meetings at Marcus's office. He wanted me to help him research potential investment properties in the Caribbean. I downloaded everything before I came to you. Sarah studied the printouts with the eye of someone who'd once made her living analyzing financial statements. The pattern was clear and damning. David had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts and into shell companies, preparing for a divorce where he could claim poverty while hiding millions. Marcus had contributed something even more valuable: leverage. His investigation team had uncovered irregularities in David's business practices that went far beyond simple tax avoidance. David had been inflating property values for loans, then using shell companies to move the money offshore. It was sophisticated, but not sophisticated enough to fool investigators with unlimited resources. The federal authorities are very interested in your husband's creative accounting, Marcus told Sarah during one of their strategy sessions. They've been building a case for months. We're simply providing them with additional evidence. Sarah had played her part perfectly, gathering information from David's home office and computer when he was at work or traveling. Her finance background proved invaluable as she decoded the complex web of transactions David had used to hide his crimes. She also documented everything about their home life. The way David spoke to her in front of Thomas, the subtle psychological manipulation, the isolation tactics. She kept a detailed journal, recording dates, times, and witnesses to David's behavior. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for David to spring it himself. The moment came on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Sarah was making breakfast when David announced he'd be filing for divorce. I've tried to make this work, he said, his voice heavy with manufactured sadness as he poured himself coffee. But I think we both know this marriage is over. Sarah set down her spatula carefully, her heart racing despite knowing this moment was coming. David, maybe we should talk about this. Try counseling. I've already filed the papers, David said, pulling a legal document from his briefcase with the satisfaction of someone revealing a winning hand. I think you'll find the terms generous, considering the circumstances. Sarah read through the divorce agreement with growing amazement at David's audacity. He was offering her a settlement of $500,000, limited visitation with Thomas every other weekend, and no claim to any of his business assets. The prenup she'd signed years ago, he claimed, limited her rights to anything more. This is very little money, David. It's more than you deserve, David said, his mask slipping slightly to reveal the contempt he'd been hiding. Considering your recent behavior? My recent behavior? David sat down across from her, his expression suddenly serious and concerned, like a doctor delivering a difficult diagnosis. Sarah, I've been patient with you, but your mental health has become a real concern. The paranoia, the accusations, the way you've been acting around Thomas. I have documentation of everything. He pulled out another folder, this one thick with what appeared to be medical records and psychological evaluations. Dr. Richardson has been very helpful in assessing your condition, David continued. He agrees that Thomas would be better off in a stable environment with his father. Sarah stared at the documents, feeling a chill of recognition. Dr. Richardson was the family psychiatrist David had insisted she see after their confrontation about Victoria. The sessions she'd thought were confidential had apparently been feeding information directly to David's legal team. "You've been planning this for a long time," Sarah said quietly. "I've been trying to protect our son from an increasingly unstable mother," David replied, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a concerned parent. "Sign the papers, Sarah. It's the best deal you're going to get." Sarah looked at her husband, this man she'd loved and trusted for 10 years, and felt the last of her illusions die. But instead of the crushing despair she'd expected, she felt something else, a cold, clear anger that sharpened her focus like a blade. "No," she said simply. David's expression darkened, the mask of concern slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not signing anything." "Then you'll force me to take this to court. And I promise you, Sarah, you won't like how that turns out. I have evidence of your mental instability, your inability to care for Thomas, even some concerning financial irregularities that could suggest criminal behavior." David leaned forward, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "Those missing funds from our household accounts, the ones transferred to offshore accounts using your electronic signature? Very difficult to explain to a jury." Sarah stood up slowly, drawing on every ounce of strength she'd built over the past weeks. "You mean the forged documents you created? The fake bank transfers? The offshore accounts that you set up in my name?" For the first time, David looked uncertain, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Sarah walked to the kitchen counter and picked up her phone. "Would you like to hear some recordings? I have some fascinating conversations between you and Victoria, and some even more interesting financial documents that show exactly how you've been hiding assets." David's face went white, the color draining from his cheeks as if he'd been physically struck. "You can't have—" "Those conversations were private." "Nothing's private when you're planning to destroy someone's life," Sarah said, her voice steady and strong for the first time in months. "Did you really think Victoria would go along with your plan forever? Did you think she enjoyed being your puppet?" "Victoria loves me," David said, but his voice was shaking, the confidence that had carried him through years of manipulation finally cracking. "Victoria was terrified of you until she found someone who could protect her from you." David stared at her in growing horror as the pieces fell into place. "Marcus Blackwood. Marcus has been very helpful. Did you know that federal investigators have been watching your business practices for months? Something about loan fraud and tax evasion. Marcus was kind enough to share some additional evidence with them." David stumbled backward, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You can't do this. You're just a housewife. You don't have the resources to fight me." Sarah smiled, and it was the most genuine smile she'd felt in years. "You're right. I don't have the resources to fight you. But I have something better. I have the truth. And I have friends who value truth more than power." The doorbell rang, its sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Through the window, Sarah could see two FBI agents standing on their front steps, their badges clearly visible. "It looks like your past has caught up with you, David." As her husband was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with shock, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating rush of victory earned through courage rather than given through charity. The war for her life was finally over, and she had won. The legal proceedings that followed David's arrest moved with surprising speed. Federal prosecutors had been building their case against him for months, and the evidence Sarah and Victoria provided was the final piece of a complex puzzle. Within 6 weeks, David Sterling was facing multiple federal charges for bank fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Sarah found herself thrust into the center of a media storm she'd never anticipated. The fall of a prominent Manhattan real estate developer was front-page news, and the revelation that his own wife had helped bring him down made the story irresistible to tabloids and legitimate news outlets alike. "Brave wife exposes husband's million-dollar fraud," read the headline in the New York Post. The Wall Street Journal took a more measured approach. "Sterling real estate empire crumbles under federal investigation." Through it all, Marcus proved to be exactly the ally Sarah needed. His lawyers handled the media requests, His security team ensured her and Thomas's safety, and his unwavering support gave her the strength to face what felt like an endless series of depositions, interviews, and court appearances. "You're stronger than you know," Marcus told her one evening as they sat in his penthouse apartment, looking out over Central Park. Thomas was asleep in the guest room, exhausted from a day at the Natural History Museum. "I don't feel strong," Sarah admitted. "I feel like I'm barely holding it together." That's what strength looks like sometimes. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going despite it. The divorce proceedings were less dramatic but equally satisfying. With David's assets frozen and his credibility destroyed, Sarah's lawyer Jenny Collins had been able to negotiate a settlement that would ensure financial security for both Sarah and Thomas for the rest of their lives. "David's trying to claim he's indigent," Jenny reported with obvious satisfaction. "His lawyer actually argued that he can't afford spousal support because all his money is tied up in federal seizure proceedings." The judge was not amused. More importantly, Sarah had been granted full custody of Thomas. David's rights had been suspended pending the outcome of his criminal trial, and given the mountain of evidence against him, it seemed unlikely he'd be in a position to challenge that arrangement anytime soon. Thomas had handled the upheaval better than anyone expected. At 8 years old, he was resilient in the way that only children could be, adapting to their new life with Marcus with the easy acceptance of someone too young to understand the full complexity of what had happened. "Is Uncle Marcus going to be my new dad?" he asked one morning over breakfast in Marcus's kitchen, a space that was somehow both grand and comfortable. Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus, who was reading the financial section of the Times while Thomas worked on a coding project on his laptop. "Uncle Marcus and I are good friends," Sarah said carefully. "Very good friends. But you'll always have just one dad, even if he's not around right now." "That's okay," Thomas said with 8-year-old pragmatism. "I like Uncle Marcus better anyway. He teaches me cool stuff." Marcus looked up from his newspaper, his expression soft. "I like teaching you cool stuff, buddy. Want to work on that robot project after school today?" As winter turned to spring, Sarah's new life began to take real shape. She'd enrolled in an executive MBA program at Columbia, determined to rebuild the career she'd abandoned years earlier. Marcus had offered her a position at his foundation, but Sarah wanted to earn her place rather than simply be given one. "I need to know I can stand on my own," she explained to him one evening as they walked through Central Park, Thomas running ahead to chase squirrels. "You've already proven that," Marcus said, "but I understand. Independence isn't just about capability, it's about confidence." Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully. Both of them were wary of moving too fast, too aware of the chaos that had brought them together. But there was something solid building between them, something based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than need or convenience. "I never thought I'd trust anyone again," Sarah admitted one night as they sat on Marcus's terrace, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights twinkle below. "Trust is earned," Marcus said, "and you've earned mine completely." The trial began in June, almost 8 months after David's arrest. Sarah testified for 2 days, detailing the financial manipulation, the psychological abuse, and the systematic campaign to isolate her from any source of help or support. David's lawyer tried to paint her as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings Victoria had made, the financial documents Sarah had gathered, the testimony of witnesses who'd seen David's behavior over the years, all of it painted a picture of a man who'd used his wealth and position to manipulate and control everyone around him. Victoria testified as well, her quiet dignity on the stand a stark contrast to the vapid influencer persona she'd once projected. She'd used the months since David's arrest to rebuild her life, starting a nonprofit organization to help women escape abusive relationships. "He made me feel like I was nothing without him," Victoria said when asked about David's hold over her. "Like my career, my future, everything depended on making him happy. It took meeting Marcus and Sarah to realize that real strength comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down." The verdict came in August, guilty on all counts. David Sterling was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay back over $80 million in fraudulently obtained loans and hidden assets. Sarah felt no joy when the sentence was read, only a profound sense of closure. The man who tried to erase her existence had been erased himself. disappeared into the anonymity of the federal prison system. But her real victory wasn't David's downfall. It was the life she'd built from the ashes of her marriage. 1 year after David's conviction, Sarah stood in the conference room of Sterling Matthews Consulting, the firm she'd founded with her divorce settlement and an investment from Marcus's venture capital fund. The irony of keeping David's name in her company's title wasn't lost on her. It was a reminder of how far she'd come, rather than where she'd been. The Peterson account is ready to move to phase 2, her business partner and former Columbia classmate Rachel Kim reported. They're thrilled with our preliminary findings. Sarah smiled, reviewing the quarterly reports spread across the mahogany table. Sterling Matthews specialized in helping women entrepreneurs navigate the complex world of business finance and venture capital, a field Sarah had discovered was still dominated by the kind of men who thought they knew what was best for everyone else. "How's the new mentorship program coming along?" Sarah asked. "We have 30 women enrolled for the next cohort," Rachel said, "and Marcus's foundation has agreed to sponsor scholarships for anyone who can't afford the fees." The mentorship program was Sarah's pride and joy, a way to ensure that other women wouldn't find themselves as isolated and vulnerable as she'd once been. The program taught financial literacy, business skills, and most importantly, how to recognize and escape manipulative relationships. "Sarah," Rachel said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "there's something else we need to discuss." Sarah looked up from the reports, noting the slight smile playing at the corners of Rachel's mouth. "Forbes wants to do a cover story about your journey from abused wife to successful entrepreneur. They're calling it The Phoenix of Wall Street." Sarah winced slightly. She'd given several interviews over the past year, but a Forbes cover story would put her in a spotlight she wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I know you're private about this stuff," Rachel continued, "but think about what this could mean for other women. Seeing that it's possible to rebuild, to fight back, to win." Before Sarah could respond, her assistant knocked and entered. "Ms. Matthews, Thomas is here for lunch." Sarah's face lit up as her 10-year-old son bounced into the conference room, his school uniform slightly rumpled, his backpack covered in NASA patches and coding stickers. "Mom, guess what? My app got accepted into the Junior Developer Showcase." Sarah hugged him tightly, marveling at how tall he'd gotten, how confident he'd become. The scared, confused little boy who'd watched his father's arrest had blossomed into a self-assured young man who spoke fluent Python and dreamed of designing video games. "That's amazing, sweetheart. Marcus will be so proud." "Speaking of Marcus," Thomas said with the casual air of someone delivering momentous news, "he wants to ask you something tonight. Something important. He made me promise not to tell you what it is, but he seems really nervous." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Any idea what this might be about?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm. She and Marcus had been living together for 6 months, a gradual transition that had felt natural and right. They'd talked about the future in abstract terms, but nothing concrete. "I have no idea," she said, though her heart was racing with possibility. That evening, Marcus was indeed nervous in a way Sarah had never seen before. He'd made dinner himself, something he rarely did, and had sent Thomas to spend the night with his friend Jake, ostensibly for a sleepover, but more likely to give them privacy. "You're acting strange," Sarah said as they finished dessert on the terrace of Marcus's penthouse. The October evening was crisp, and the city sparkled below them like a carpet of diamonds. "Am I?" Marcus asked, his voice slightly higher than usual. "I don't feel strange. Do I seem strange? Because I'm not trying to seem strange." Sarah laughed. "Marcus Blackwood, master of billion-dollar negotiations, is nervous about something. This must be serious." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the terrace and back. "Sarah, we need to talk." Sarah's heart sank. Those words, in her experience, never led anywhere good. "Okay, what about?" "About us. About our future. About what we want." Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face her. "I've been thinking about this for months, and I know it might seem fast, but it doesn't feel fast to me. It feels like we've been building toward this since the day you walked into my office." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Building toward what?" Marcus dropped to one knee beside her chair, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "This." Sarah stared at the box, then at Marcus's face, seeing hope and vulnerability and love shining in his eyes. "Sarah Matthews," he said, his voice steady now, "you are the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You've shown me what it means to fight for what matters, to build something beautiful from something broken. I love your courage, your intelligence, your laugh, the way you make everything better just by being in the room." He opened the box to reveal a ring that was elegant and classic, nothing like the ostentatious diamond David had given her years ago. This was a ring chosen by someone who knew her, who understood that true beauty lay in simplicity and authenticity. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving that I'm worthy of the gift you've already given me?" Sarah looked at this man who'd helped her reclaim her life, who'd stood by her through the darkest period of her existence, who'd never once tried to control or diminish her. She thought about the scared, isolated woman she'd been just 2 years ago, and the confident, successful woman she'd become. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely, yes." As Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. Not because she needed a man to complete her, she learned she was whole all by herself, but because she'd found someone who enhanced her life rather than limiting it. "Thomas is going to be so excited," she said through her tears. "He's been dropping hints for months about wanting to make it official." "He actually helped me pick out the ring," Marcus admitted. "He said it needed to be mom-appropriate, which apparently means classy but not too flashy." Sarah laughed, imagining her 10-year-old son seriously considering engagement rings. "He's got good taste. He gets that from his mother." As they sat together on the terrace, planning their future and dreaming about the possibilities ahead, Sarah reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, she'd been a woman with no options, no allies, and no hope. Tonight, she was engaged to a man who loved and respected her, running a successful business that helped other women, and raising a son who was confident in his own worth. The silent exit from her old life had become the foundation for everything she'd built since. She'd learned that the most powerful revenge wasn't destroying your enemies. It was living so well that their opinions became irrelevant. "I love you," Marcus said quietly, his arm around her as they watched the city lights twinkle below. "I love you too," Sarah replied, feeling the truth of those words in every cell of her body. She'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not someone to save her, but someone to share the life she'd saved for herself. 2 years after her engagement to Marcus, Sarah thought she'd left the chaos of her past behind forever. Sterling Matthews Consulting was thriving, with offices in New York and Los Angeles. Thomas, now 12, was flourishing in his private school and had already received early interest from MIT for his coding abilities. Her marriage to Marcus was everything she dreamed a partnership could be: equal, supportive, and built on genuine love and respect. Then David got out of prison. His sentence had been reduced for good behavior and cooperation with federal authorities in related cases. After serving just 5 years of his 15-year sentence, David Sterling was a free man, and he had apparently spent his time behind bars planning his return to prominence. "He's been granted supervised visitation with Thomas," Jenny Collins informed Sarah during an emergency meeting at Sarah's office. 3 hours every other Sunday, supervised by a court-appointed guardian. Sarah felt the familiar chill of fear she'd thought she'd conquered forever. How is that possible? He was convicted of felonies. He's completed anger management and parenting classes. His lawyer argued successfully that he's been rehabilitated and deserves a chance to rebuild his relationship with his son. Jenny's expression was grim. The judge was sympathetic to the argument that children need their fathers. "What does Thomas think about this?" "That's up to you to find out. But Sarah, there's more." Jenny slid a folder across the desk. "David's been busy since his release. He's written a book." Sarah opened the folder to find a galley copy of a memoir titled "Redemption: How I Lost Everything and Found My Soul." David's photo on the back cover showed a man who looked older, grayer, but somehow more polished than when he'd gone to prison. "He's positioning himself as a reformed man who made mistakes but learned from them," Jenny continued. "The book paints him as a victim of ambition who lost sight of what really mattered. He talks about missing you and Thomas. about regretting his choices. Sarah flipped through the pages, her anger growing with each sentence. David had rewritten history completely, turning himself into a sympathetic figure while carefully omitting the psychological abuse, the manipulation, the systematic campaign to destroy her life. He's going on a media tour next month. Morning shows, podcasts, speaking engagements about redemption and second chances. Jenny's voice was tight with fury. He's trying to rehabilitate his image. That evening, Sarah sat Thomas down for one of the hardest conversations of her life. They were in the living room of the penthouse she now shared with Marcus, the space that had become their family home, filled with laughter and warmth and the easy comfort of people who genuinely loved each other. Thomas, I need to talk to you about your father. Her son, now tall for his age and bearing an increasing resemblance to David around the eyes, looked up from his laptop where he'd been working on a program that could analyze stock market patterns. Is he getting out of prison? Sarah was sometimes amazed by how perceptive Thomas had become. Prison had been an abstract concept to him when David was first sentenced. But as he'd grown older, he'd understood more about why his father was gone. He got out last week, and the court has decided that he should be allowed to see you sometimes, if you want to see him. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still poised over his keyboard. Do you think I should? I think that's entirely up to you, sweetheart. Whatever you decide, Marcus and I will support you completely. What if I don't want to see him? Sarah felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. Then you don't have to. You're old enough to have a say in this decision. But what if I do want to see him? Would that hurt your feelings? Sarah pulled her son into a hug, marveling at his emotional intelligence, his concern for others, even when dealing with his own confusion. Thomas, your feelings about your father have nothing to do with my feelings about him. He's your dad, and it's okay if part of you wants to know him. That doesn't make you disloyal to me or Marcus. I think I want to see him, Thomas said quietly, just to see who he is now, to see if he's different. The first visitation was scheduled for the following Sunday at a neutral location, a family services center in Midtown Manhattan. Sarah dropped Thomas off with a mixture of anxiety and determination to let her son make his own choices about this relationship. Marcus was waiting in the car when she came back out, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions she was feeling. How was he? Marcus asked. Nervous, but resolute. He's such a strong kid, Marcus. Stronger than I was at his age. Stronger than I was 5 years ago. He gets that from his mother. They drove to Central Park and walked the Reservoir Loop, a routine they'd developed for dealing with stress and big decisions. The October afternoon was crisp and beautiful, the kind of day that made New York feel like the center of the universe. David's going to try to use Thomas to get back into our lives, Sarah said as they walked. I can feel it. This isn't about rebuilding a relationship with his son. This is about rebuilding his image. Probably, but Thomas is smart, and he knows who's been there for him. Whatever David tries, I don't think it's going to work the way he hopes. Marcus was right, but not in the way either of them expected. Thomas came back from his visitation quiet and thoughtful, but not upset. At dinner, he shared his assessment of his father with the analytical precision of someone much older. He's different, Thomas said, cutting his chicken with careful precision. He talks differently, like he's giving a speech all the time. And he kept asking me questions about you guys, about how much money we have, about whether you're really happy. Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus. What did you tell him? That you're the happiest I've ever seen you, and that Marcus is the best stepdad I could ask for, even if it's not official yet. Thomas looked up from his plate. Is it weird that I'm not more excited to see him? I thought I would be, but mostly I just felt sorry for him. Why did you feel sorry for him? Marcus asked gently. Because he seemed lonely and kind of desperate, like he was trying really hard to make me like him. But he doesn't really know how. Thomas paused, considering his words carefully. You guys don't try to make me like you. You just do things that make me happy because you want me to be happy. He was doing things because he wanted something from me. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her son's emotional intelligence, his ability to see through manipulation, even from someone who shared his DNA. The visitations continued for several months, but Thomas's enthusiasm for them waned quickly. David's attempts to insert himself back into their lives, became increasingly transparent and desperate. He sent expensive gifts that Thomas didn't want, made promises about trips and experiences that never materialized, and asked increasingly inappropriate questions about Sarah and Marcus's relationship and finances. The final straw came when David suggested that Thomas might want to spend part of his summer vacation with him, away from the artificial environment Marcus's wealth had created. He said, "I need to understand what real life is like," Thomas told Sarah after that particular visit. He said, "Living with you guys wasn't preparing me for the real world." That night, Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible for the woman she'd been 5 years earlier. She called David directly. "This ends now," she told him, her voice calm but implacable. "You're using Thomas to try to hurt me, and I won't allow it." "I'm trying to rebuild a relationship with my son," David replied, but she could hear the old arrogance creeping back into his voice. "Something you've made very difficult with your alienation campaign. Thomas is old enough to make his own decisions about you, and he's decided he doesn't want to see you anymore. That's not his decision to make. I have court-ordered visitation rights, which we'll respect if Thomas wants to exercise them. But I'm not going to force a 12-year-old boy to spend time with someone who makes him uncomfortable just because a judge said so 5 years ago." There was a long pause. Then David played his final card, the one Sarah had been expecting. "I'm going to take you back to court, Sarah. I'm going to show them how you've poisoned my son against me, how you've used your new husband's money to create a lifestyle that makes me look inadequate. I'm going to fight for full custody." Sarah felt the old fear try to claw its way back up her throat, but it had no power over her anymore. She wasn't the isolated, dependent woman David had tried to destroy. She was successful in her own right, surrounded by people who loved and supported her, and she'd learned that the best way to deal with bullies was to call their bluff. "Do it," she said simply. "Take me to court. Let's see how that works out for you." The line went quiet. David had expected threats to break her, as they had in the past. He hadn't expected calm acceptance of his challenge. "I will," he said finally, but the confidence was gone from his voice. "I'll be ready," Sarah replied and hung up. She turned to find Marcus and Thomas watching her from the kitchen doorway, both of them with expressions of concern and admiration. "Is he going to try to take me away?" Thomas asked. Sarah knelt down to her son's level, taking his hands in hers. "He's going to try. But Thomas, you're not the same scared little boy you were when this all started, and I'm not the same scared woman. We're a family now, the three of us, and families stick together. Besides," Marcus added with a slight smile, "I know some very good lawyers." The custody battle that followed was the last test of everything Sarah had become. David's legal team, funded by his book advance and speaking fees, painted her as a gold digger who had used her son as a weapon against his father. They argued that Marcus's wealth had created an artificial environment that was harmful to Thomas's development, and that the boy needed his biological father's influence to become a well-rounded man. Sarah's team, led by Jenny Collins and backed by Marcus's resources, presented a different story. They showed the court documentation of David's previous manipulation and abuse, the recording of his statements about destroying Sarah's life, and most importantly, they presented Thomas himself. At 12 years old, Thomas was old enough for the court to consider his preferences, and he was remarkably articulate about his feelings regarding his father. "I don't hate him," Thomas told the judge during a private interview, "but I don't trust him either. He talks to me like I'm a prop in his life, not like I'm a real person with my own thoughts and feelings. My mom and Marcus talk to me like I matter." The judge, a woman in her 50s who had presided over hundreds of custody cases, was clearly moved by Thomas's maturity and insight. But it was Sarah's testimony that sealed the case. Over 2 days on the witness stand, she detailed not just David's past abuse, but the person she'd become since leaving him. She spoke about her business, her work helping other women, her graduate degree, and the stable, loving home she'd built with Marcus. "Your Honor," she said during her final statement, "I'm not the same woman who was trapped in an abusive marriage 5 years ago. I'm not asking you to keep Thomas away from his father out of spite or revenge. I'm asking you to recognize that my son deserves to live in an environment where he's valued for who he is, not used as a tool to hurt other people." David's own testimony backfired spectacularly. His attempts to portray himself as a reformed man who deserved a second chance were undermined by his obvious bitterness and his continued attempts to manipulate the narrative. When pressed about his past behavior, he became defensive and angry, showing flashes of the controlling personality that had destroyed his first marriage. "The truth is," David said during cross-examination, his composure finally cracking, "Sarah has turned my son against me using another man's money. She's created a fantasy world where she's the victim and I'm the villain, when all I've ever tried to do is provide for my family." Jenny Collins pounced on the opening. "Mr. Sterling, isn't it true that you told Ms. Hayes, and I quote, 'Sarah is a weak woman who's never had to fight for anything in her life. She doesn't deserve honesty. She deserves exactly what she's going to get.'" "Nothing?" David's face flushed red. "That was taken out of context. I was under enormous stress. And isn't it true that you systematically moved marital assets into offshore accounts to hide them from your wife during divorce proceedings? I was protecting legitimate business interests. And isn't it true that you forged your wife's signature on financial documents and then tried to frame her for embezzlement?" David's lawyer objected. But the damage was done. The man who had spent 5 years in prison, supposedly learning from his mistakes, was revealing himself to be exactly the same manipulative narcissist he'd always been. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Thomas would remain in Sarah's primary custody, with David granted supervised visitation only if Thomas requested it. The court found that David had failed to demonstrate any genuine rehabilitation and that his continued attempts to manipulate the situation showed he remained a potential threat to his son's emotional well-being. "This court's primary concern is the best interests of the child," Judge Martinez stated. "While we recognize the importance of father-child relationships, we cannot ignore evidence of continued manipulative behavior and the child's own clearly expressed preferences." Outside the courthouse, David made one final attempt to control the narrative. He'd arranged for a small group of supporters and a few media outlets to witness his statement about the injustice of the ruling and how the family court system was biased against fathers. Sarah watched from across the street as David played his victim card one last time, claiming that wealthy elites like Marcus Blackwood could buy any outcome they wanted in the American justice system. But his audience was sparse, and his message felt hollow even to the few reporters who'd bothered to show up. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, standing between Sarah and Marcus as they watched David's impromptu press conference. "It's over," Sarah confirmed, putting her arm around her son's shoulders. "He can't hurt us anymore." "Good," Thomas said simply. "Can we go home now? I want to work on my robotics project." As they walked away from the courthouse, Sarah reflected on how different this moment felt from the terror and helplessness she'd experienced during her first confrontation with David's manipulation. She was no longer fighting for survival. She was protecting the life she'd built through her own strength and determination. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the deck of Marcus's yacht, the Athena, watching the Mediterranean sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were celebrating the 5th anniversary of her escape from David, a date they'd turned into a family holiday, celebrating courage, resilience, and new beginnings. Thomas, now 13 and taller than his mother, was teaching Marcus's niece how to use the diving equipment. His easy confidence and natural leadership were a joy to watch. The scared little boy who'd once been caught between his parents' war had grown into a young man who knew his own worth. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, settling beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. It had become their traditional question, asked annually on this date. Sarah considered the question seriously, as she always did. She thought about the naive young woman who'd fallen in love with David Sterling's charm and confidence. She thought about the years of slowly shrinking, of accepting less and less of herself until she'd almost disappeared entirely. She thought about the terror of those final months when she'd believed she was completely powerless. "I regret the time I lost," she said finally. "I regret that it took me so long to find my courage, but I don't regret the journey because it led me here." She gestured around the yacht, but she wasn't referring to the luxury or the wealth. She was talking about the family they'd built, the love they shared, the work that gave her life meaning. "I spent years thinking my worth was tied to being someone's wife, someone's mother. I thought I needed to be taken care of." Sarah stood and walked to the railing, looking out at the endless blue horizon. Now I know that the most valuable thing I can be is myself. Everything else is just bonus. Marcus joined her at the railing, slipping his arm around her waist. Thomas wants to know if we can take the jet to London next month. Apparently, there's a technology conference he's desperate to attend. Sarah laughed. 13 years old and already jet-setting to international conferences. What have we created? A boy who knows his worth and isn't afraid to pursue his dreams, like his mother. Down below, they could hear Thomas and his cousin laughing as they experimented with underwater photography equipment. The sound filled Sarah with a deep contentment that had nothing to do with their surroundings and everything to do with the knowledge that she'd given her son something David never could. The security of unconditional love and the confidence to be authentically himself. I got a call from Victoria yesterday, Sarah said. Her nonprofit just received a $10 million grant from the Department of Justice to expand their programs nationwide. That's wonderful. How many women do they think they'll be able to help? Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Sarah smiled, thinking about her former rival, who'd become an unexpected ally and then a genuine friend. She said something interesting. She said that watching me rebuild my life gave her the courage to rebuild hers. It was true. In the years since David's downfall, both women had transformed their experiences into forces for positive change. Victoria's organization had helped hundreds of women escape abusive relationships, while Sarah's consulting firm had empowered female entrepreneurs to build independent, successful businesses. You know what the best part is? Sarah said. David thought destroying me would make him more powerful. Instead, helping me discover my own strength has made both Victoria and me more successful than he ever was. Marcus smiled. The best revenge is living well. No, Sarah said, turning to face him. The best revenge is using your freedom to lift others up. Success that only benefits you is hollow. Success that creates opportunities for others is immortal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. Not because her story was over, but because she'd finally become the protagonist of her own life. The girl who'd once needed saving had become the woman who saved herself. And in doing so, she discovered that the most powerful victory wasn't defeating your enemies. It was becoming so completely yourself that their opinions became irrelevant. I love you, Marcus said quietly, his arm around her as they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. I love you too, Sarah replied, feeling the truth of those words in every cell of her body. She'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not someone to complete her, but someone to share the complete life she'd built for herself. In the distance, Thomas called out that he'd spotted dolphins playing in the yacht's wake. Sarah and Marcus hurried to join him at the bow, where they stood together as a family, watching the graceful creatures dance through the phosphorescent water. It was a perfect metaphor for Sarah's journey. She'd learned to navigate the depths without losing herself, to play in the wake of her own choices, and to move forward with grace and power toward whatever horizon awaited. The silent exit from her old life had become the foundation for everything beautiful that followed. And as she watched the dolphins disappear into the vast, starlit sea, Sarah knew that the best chapters of her story were still being written. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear that escape and rebuilding are possible, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover these powerful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you've witnessed similar situations of financial or emotional manipulation. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because every week we bring you real stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Your support helps us continue sharing these tales of resilience and transformation.